Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week of This Week in DEI. This week is going to be a talk about chivalry, not the order, but the word, the concept itself, because it is so central to who we are in the SCA. And it informs every part of who we are, including the mission of the DEI, just officer corps and everything that we're trying to make happen here. So it's a really good discussion to have. So I'm going to let folks introduce themselves. I'm going to go first because I'm already talking. A lot of you know me. I'm Baroness Zahra. I am the SCA DEI officer currently. So go ahead, Gigi.
Hi, I am Giada in the SCA, Gigi Colson mundanely. I am on the board of directors for the SCA, and I'm the ombudsman for the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office.
I suppose that goes to me. I am Justin DeLeon. I'm a knight who lives in Ontier. I've been in the SCA for about 38 years. I am on the Kingdom of Ontier's Council of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and I am looking forward to having a chance to answer many of your questions and to have the discussion tonight.
Yes, and in light of the whole questions thing, so this will be streaming on Facebook Live. You can type any questions that you have for us that you want to see us discuss or do our best to try to answer, and we will get them as though by magic. It is my mod. He's wonderful. Thank you, mod. So please do just drop those questions in Facebook Live and we'll take a look at them. But for now, let's just jump right in, right? All right. What is chivalry?
So, I mean, we have access to things like dictionaries and encyclopedias. So if you go to like Encyclopedia Britannica and you look up chivalry, the entry talks about chivalry in the sense of honorable and courteous conduct. And I think that one really speaks to me as kind of how the SCA views it in general, a big tent, honorable and courteous conduct.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Well, yeah, I think that's a perfect encapsulation of the modern perspective of chivalry. The idea that as it was reimagined, I guess you might say, by Victorian historians and by the culture of late 19th century, early 20th century Europeans. The whole history of chivalry, of course, is longer. The whole history of the idea is bigger, but I think that's how we think of it. I certainly hope that's how we think of it and how we practice it.
So, of course, because we are an educational nonprofit, right? We also want to look at chivalry in history. So I've taught a couple of classes for equity and inclusion that include a slide or two on what is chivalry in the SCA in reference to equity and inclusion. So from my very short study of chivalry, I learned that the chivalric movement arose during the Middle Ages to promote ethical behavior. And so when I found that out, I was like, well, then that kind of makes sense to connect it to equity and inclusion, because equity and inclusion, we're endeavoring to appoint officers and have classes and talk about the concepts because we are trying to promote ethical behavior in the SCA currently. So as is written, these various codes of chivalry and references to chivalry and history are kind of a catalyst, I think, for equity and inclusion discussions in the SCA, because chivalry is courtesy, chivalry is kindness, chivalry is honor, right? One of the volumes that I took a class on was the Chanson de Roland. And the gentleman who taught the class talked about, he read the entire tome and then he pulled out all of the references to what is chivalry from it. And so he came up with 3 basic things: true and honest advice to your king, loyalty to the commands of your king, and courage in the face of death. And I think those are things that we see knights in the SCA really take to heart, like true and honest advice as a peerage circle to your king, service to your king, loyalty to the commands and the word of your king and the laws of your kingdom, and also courage on the battlefield. When we go to wars, when we have tournaments, like we really take that seriously. So I think those things are really pulled forward in the embodiment of what I see in the Order of the Chivalry in the SCA.
Well, and I remember the first time I had taken one of your classes and I saw how you had couched the DEI mission firmly within the realm of what our interpretation of chivalry was, right? And we're going to talk about the ways in which that can differ. It was really moving for me because I think it's very relatable. I think it connects for a lot of people. DEI is a lot of modern discussion sometimes, and I think it's sometimes difficult for people to really contextualize it well within the SCA because we are coming at it from a different perspective. So being able to have that touchstone that we can say, this is how we're couching the discussion. Chivalry is courtesy. Behaving in an equitable and inclusive manner is part of being courteous to other people. That for me was really, it was good. I loved it.
Well, and I also think that that's reinforced to an extent by elements of historical concepts of chivalry, right? If you look, for example, at the beginning of the 13th century, there's a man named Ramon Lull. He writes one of the really well-known pieces, a homiletic manual, basically instructing people on chivalric behavior and the order of chivalry specifically. But he goes into some extent talking about how virtue should be reflected in people. And one of the things that he talks about is the extent to which someone who is chivalrous is obliged to act to protect and help those people who are in a situation where they cannot help themselves, right? Or where they are disadvantaged for some reason, right? In the context of the history, it engages in what we would think of now as some benevolent sexism, right? And the idea that women are inherently weak and some of these other ideas that obviously are very problematic. But it tries to emphasize the idea that the actions themselves are based on the fact that they are doing this because the person is in a situation where I have strength, I have power because of the class that I belong to, because of who I am, right? And I can help someone who does not have that thing, right? And so these ideas, you know, the ideas of courtesy, the ideas of assisting people, these are ideas that carry through historically, right? The motivation perhaps as to why you're doing it, or the specific groups of people may vary, but the idea of, you know, honorable and courteous conduct and directing it towards, you know, people is constant, I guess. And it fits with the mission of the SCA, especially with regards to DEI.
Oh, girl, you're muted.
I agree. And I think another phrase we hear a lot is Charlemagne's Code of Chivalry. And I couldn't really nail that down to one specific volume, but there's a list that I found, and it kind of echoes some of the things that you said about Lull's reference: protecting the weak and defenseless, not giving wanton offense, avoiding unfairness and deceit, fighting for the welfare of all, and defending the honor of other people. I think it goes hand in hand with what we expect from all of our, not just our participants, but especially our peers and our officers. And I think that's one reason in corpora, chivalry is considered a requirement for participation, for holding office, and for being royal, or for being a peer, a bestowed peer. It's found, the word chivalry or chivalric is found on 12 pages of our governing documents, including, you know, just alone, and then with chivalric ideals and with chivalrous conduct, right? And all of our peerages, I think corpora 8A4 breaks down each peerage and the elements that are required to be a member of that peerage. And for each one, chivalry, laurels, pels, mods, roses, it says, set an example of courtesy and chivalrous conduct. So this is a requirement for those people that we look up to as kind of the ideals in our society to behave in this manner. And I think it's something that we all take very seriously, even though we don't have discussions about it all the time. I think it's something that's on our mind a lot when we enter an event. You know, we kind of take off our modern clothes and put on our SCA garb, and we want to embody that ideal.
Yeah, to complicate it though, right? We are modern people, products of modern society. Some of us have looked into this to a greater degree, right, in the historical sense. And some of us are just kind of like, you know, we bring to the table what we saw in movies, what we saw in books, just whatever we've conceptualized. There's a word called an ideogram or an ideograph. And the idea is that it's a word that has this really strong emotional value to us, but the meaning is a little bit different for everyone. So something like justice or freedom, it's important, right? I like freedom. It's good. Everyone wants that. But what does it mean? Everyone thinks it means a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Chivalry is that for a lot of people, and we never define it in a very specific way. We all just kind of assume we're on the same page, and we're not always. So I feel like that complicates things a little bit. And I'd be interested to see what you guys think about that concept.
So it's an interesting bit. The word chivalry is, as an ideogram or ideograph, is composed of ideals that are likewise ideograms and ideographs, right? So the entire concept is based on other concepts, and as you move through time, right, these things change. As you move culturally, these things change. But one of the things that I think is valuable about looking at it, looking back on it, and linking it to what we're doing now, is the opportunity to change it, right, so to speak, to claim it and to categorize it and to envision it and to make that ideogram our ideogram for what it means, right? And we can do that by detaching, for example, concepts of identity, concepts of social class, concepts that they would have wanted, that were incredibly important to them, right? But now we have a better understanding, or at least a different understanding, of how the world should and must be arranged for the benefit of the most people.
So one of the things that we don't abide by, that people in the Middle Ages did, is this thing called the chain of being, right? This hierarchy that starts with like God and then like ends up with animals, right? But even in your reference to Lull, he said that if you are better than someone else because you're in a different class, and you're given this status by birth, even someone in a lower class than you would want to help them. You would want to defend them. You would want to protect them if they needed it. So I think that is also something we can pull forward, not the idea that there are some classes better than others, not that at all, not classism, but that if someone is different than you and needs your help, then you'll give it to them. If someone is different than you and needs your protection or needs you to speak up for them, even when they're not there, that you will do that. And I think it also goes back to the chanson de Roland, honest advice to your king. In a peerage circle, if someone's being discussed and you know that they're being maligned, maybe because they are different, I think it's your duty as a peer to speak up and say, no, let's talk about who this person really is. Let's stay on subject. Let's be honest with each other. And I think those are little ways that we can pull some of the ideals in the past to the SCA modernly, but still honor those past ideals.
Yeah, I struggle a lot with the idea that like we're all kind of coming at this from a different perspective, and it is kind of the backbone rule of society. And so it's hard to give people a standard that you can't give more specifics about, right? Expecting people to uphold something that we know is going to look different. Because I mean, when you get right down to it, like the word comes from what, just horsed warrior or horsed rider, right? It's literally just like
Man
So
with
how did we overlay all of this?
Horsemen, basically.
I
Yeah.
think the fact that you teach DEI classes help with that, though. It helps people understand that equity and inclusion, the SCA, doesn't mean maybe what it means at your job. But even at your job, when you take your training for diversity or equity inclusion, you learn what your employer wants from you. So in your courses, you have courses for officers, you have courses just for participants, you've given courses to the board of directors even. In those courses, you break down what it means in our society. And I think that is what we're going to have to do slowly but surely. You know, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So how do you understand, you know, equity and inclusion and chivalry? One bite at a time. Start taking the courses that are available. Start having the conversations with people. At work, we understand that some actions are not okay, right? You can't proselytize. You can't walk around, you know, insulting classes of people, right? You can't, outbursts of anger are forbidden, right? You can't physically assault someone without consequences. This is the same thing we're saying in the SCA as it relates to equity and inclusion, but also we're pulling chivalry in because we are a historical education society. And again, chivalry is in our governing documents. It's important to us. So I think being honest, defending others, protecting the honor of others. I think for me as a peer, one of the most important parts of chivalry that I can embody is kindness and love. Mm-hmm. Treating other people in a loving and kind manner. That will bring along with it courtesy, respect, honesty, all of those things will come along with it. And that also kind of falls in line with the religious ideology of the past too, right? Because that is the life they lived. Everything was explained by the church. And so Justin and I were talking about this the other day. Part of chivalry was so important. It wasn't just lip service. It was, if you don't live up to these ideals, you could be punished by God. Like, this was serious. They didn't take it lightly, and I don't think we should either.
The thing that we run into when describing chivalry, as far as trying to pin it down, right, is that we can look at different historical authors and we can look at modern people discussing it, right? And they will list different virtues. The reason that they do that is because each individual, you know, to an extent, as you said, sees something reflected in this concept that they want to talk about, right? But when we examine the earlier historical documents, like Lull's one of the oldest ones we have surviving. It lists 7, right? 7 basic, you know, virtuous ideas. And those ideas are all words that we have a strong grasp on today, right? When I look at those, right, I'm gonna pull it up if you give me half a second, because I did actually pull it up. He lists justice, prudence, charity, temperance, faith, hope, and fortitude, right? And all of those things contain multiple underlying concepts. So when you talk about the idea of kindness and love, right, that sort of idea is very much supported in the concept of charity, right? It's very much supported in the concept of prudence and temperance, right? That, you know, and so all of these ideas that we have of virtuous behavior are really what I want to talk about is, right? They're recognizable characteristics to what we think good adult behavior is in a Western society, right? I would argue that it's probably more universal than that, but I can certainly say that in a Western society, we hold that, you know, certain ideas are generally preferred over others, right? And I think that mission, that idea is valuable, you know, to the SCA, even going forward, if we begin to strip out more and more of the Europeanness, right, of the organization, we can still talk about things in terms of virtue, not just in terms of chivalry, right? And because chivalry is a as an object is composed of virtues and virtuous behavior.
Yeah, the virtues are kind of there's a ton, right? Like there's no set agreed upon that we're like, yep, this is what we in the SCA consider the virtues to be. And while a lot of them do overlap in some ways, and we talked about kind of different ways that they juxtapose with things like the virtues versus the sins, I think it's interesting to see what becomes relevant for us. I think it's interesting to see in what ways it becomes relevant, because again, people come into the SCA and these things mean things to them already. So the idea of loyalty, for example, I had a really good conversation with a friend who brought up the idea that loyalty, when you're coming from like a team sport, means something very different, because loyalty is to your team and your own. And the honor is in the victory of your team over another. Well, that's different than how we kind of look at that. And if that's the perspective that you have, you're bringing something in that's very different. And maybe you're prioritizing things a little bit differently. So I'd be interested to kind of think more about what virtues we've kind of championed and what virtues that we hold highly, and how we do that. And if there's differences from person to person that we need to keep taking into account as we try to communicate effectively and create a new program, a new policy, and everything else. So I'd be interested to hear both your thoughts on that for sure.
I'll let Van go. Throw him under the bus first.
All right. So if we're looking at virtues and which ones we really want to maintain, right, and which ones we might tend to de-emphasize, I think the most obvious one that comes to mind that was so very central to historical concepts of chivalry as understood in the Middle Ages, right, is faith. We can still have faith, the belief in something invisible, right? But the SCA expressly does not have religious practices involved in its events. We don't endorse particular views of God or particular views of religion. And therefore, the idea of faith is something that's going to be a very individual virtue. But on almost the vast majority of lists of virtues you'll find in the Middle Ages and later, you'll find faith being one of them. And part of that's just simply because faith was so very central to the lives of people in the Middle Ages. It's arguably incomprehensibly central to the lives of people in the Middle Ages by comparison to modern audiences, modern people in the SCA. Other virtues that I tend to think that while we probably should practice it more, I tend to think that the virtue of temperance kind of tends to go out the window a bit. And I mean, because it applies across the board. I mean, obviously there's the more modern concept of temperance in association with, alcohol and that sort of thing. And I personally don't drink very much, almost at all. And as a result, it's something that, I see and perceive, but it's not something that I pursue necessarily, right? Temperance, though, also can just be holding an appropriate temper, right? Maintaining an appropriate attitude in a given situation, seeking the golden mean, so to speak, in things. And so, but again, it's probably one of the ones that's not particularly going to be central to most people's experience in the SCA. Things like charity, prudence, right? Prudence is a word that it depends on who you're reading, but for example, Lowell describes it very much in association with both wisdom and reason, right? And he in his section, in fact, on the training of a knight's son to become a knight, he talks about the idea of reason being far more important than skill at arms, because with planning and forethought, you can defeat, you know, armies much more efficaciously than you can with, a set of soldiers, basically, who are not, operating with forethought. I think justice is important. The concept of justice that is not just the application of law, but the concept of justice that is applying action in the right way when encountering an occurrence, I guess the best way of saying it, right? So if someone does something and you are asked, or you see it go on, do you respond to it, right? How do you respond to it? What is the right thing to do in a given situation? These are ideas of justice that go beyond law, right, and deal more directly with the application of the virtues in action, right? Being appropriately charitable, using reason, not just reacting emotionally, right? Using wisdom, looking at the experience that you've had in life or the experiences of others, and comparing how the outcomes of various things worked, right? Courtesy, super important. I mean, phenomenally important. One of my favorite quotes from Gandhi has always been strength wedded to courtesy, and strength wedded to courtesy is irresistible, basically. So anyway.
So in listening to you go over some of the virtues, I thought about personally, when I think about chivalry, and I talked a little bit about how it's in corpora, right? And being on the board of directors, we use corpora to evaluate lots of different things, policy, people's actions. We want to uphold it. So when it says in the intro that chivalric ideals of the period serve to unify our events and activities, when we say in the duties of participants that, or the duties of royalty, that royalty shall be the chief examples of chivalry, courtesy, and the other virtues appropriate to the ideals of society, and shall inspire these virtues in their subjects. When it talks about during lists, combatants shall behave in a knightly and chivalrous manner. It just goes back to what Jessica brought up. We use that word a lot, chivalry, chivalrous. But what does it mean? Which virtue do you choose to explain it in a certain instance is kind of what I'm thinking. On a field is different, on a field of combat is different than if you are advising your king on a matter. In a peerage circle, when you're discussing how to best promote the arts, it's a different, it would be a different virtue that you would pull up then. But to me, the singular unifying maybe phrase for me is, what is the good and right thing to do at the moment, right? The good and right thing to do in all of those instances, to me, would be what the chivalrous thing to do would be, if that makes any sense. You talked a little bit about justice and the fact that it goes beyond law, prudence as it applies to reason. To me, and when you're faced with a decision of what am I going to do in this situation, and you try to think of what is the good and right thing for me to do, it would involve doing those things. When you're thinking about justice, it would involve looking beyond the law. When you're thinking about perhaps discussing a candidate in a peerage circle, looking at them as human beings, not expecting more from them than maybe you could have given, not holding them to a higher standard, being fair, being reasonable. So for me, the good and right thing to do at the moment would be the chivalrous thing. Does that make sense, Jess? Okay. So for me, that is going to be my phrase when I try to explain chivalry to people. I'm gonna say the good and right thing and to do at the moment. What is the good and right thing for us to do now? And I also used to use that. I'm pulling that back because I used to use that in the classes I taught about equity and inclusion. When we talked about bystander intervention, even what is the good and right thing to do in the moment when someone insults someone else and it's not okay? Would the good and right thing to do at that moment be to be silent? I don't think so. If you see someone struggling across a muddy field that's uneven terrain and a dress in patterns, what would the good and right thing to do at that moment be? It would be maybe to offer some assistance if they're carrying something. Not because you think they are weak, but because it looks like they may need assistance at that moment. So yeah, good and right. I'm gonna get a t-shirt, good and right.
I think that's a really, I think that's a good like golden rule, right? If you're ever in a point where you're like, I think that that's a good thing to fall back on. I do want to connect. We're gonna jump around, so that's what we're gonna do. Something that Van said. I think you were quoting maybe Wall or Ducharme. I don't know, whoever it was. It connects to the idea of different perspectives of chivalry from different sources. So my fiance is Israeli. He speaks Hebrew fluently. He immigrated here a little bit later in life, and so I've learned a ton of just a different perspective. He is in the armored community. Chivalry is something that he's interested in. He's taught me a lot. We've talked about it a lot. When I was thinking a lot about different virtues, I settled on talking about this concept of patience. And he kind of just offhandedly was just like, oh, that's funny. In Hebrew, that translates to suffering. And I was like, what? Like, this was so interesting for me to like connect it in this different way. So when you were talking about like temperance and how we've kind of thrown that out the window, I'm like, well, I feel like temperance, patience go hand in hand. And of course, like as a virtue, that's difficult. It requires stepping outside of the self. It requires doing something that is not necessarily going to be beneficial to you in any way. The idea that patience is suffering, obviously, for us, we might not conceive of it that way, but certainly there are times where to be patient is to put away the response that would make you feel better in the moment. It's to temper your attitude and your desires and whatever need for justification you have. And then you had mentioned something else. You had been quoting someone, and there's a proverb in Mishle, and I had to look it up. It's for you shall wage war for yourself with strategies, and the victory results from the superiority of the counselor. And that was so close to what you had quoted. I know that proverb from Mishle because when I commissioned a shield, I had it put on the shield for my fiance. So it's really interesting to see how these things connect outside of medieval Europe, outside of the time period that we kind of, I don't want to say that we're in because obviously we are much broader than that at this point, but where we originated the SCA in, because there is such connection across different cultures, different time periods, different interpretations, and even things aren't even consistent in that time period for sure. We've quoted several different people just this far, so I don't know. It really struck me while you were talking.
Cross-cultural discussions of morality and virtue are something that are sometimes difficult because they can be fraught with misunderstanding of context. They can be some lack of knowledge of the culture, which results in mistranslation. But fundamentally, there are social characteristics that humans have, right? To some extent, in that they generally don't like pain. They don't like to hurt each other. They try to work together cooperatively, right? they try to, in war, limit atrocities, broadly speaking, right? And when you start looking at the social characteristics of humans, right, as opposed to the specific, I guess you might say specific cultural, I don't want to use idiomatic, that's not quite what I mean, but the very specific sorts of ideas that a culture holds as characteristics, those might vary, but we can look at different cultures. Like one of the things that I've been doing is this series of quotes from different places and different times, right? And I've included quotes of virtuous behavior that we would recognize in the modern era from as early as 2900 BCE, right? And those are from Egyptian instructional texts, right? Things that basically talk about, if someone is standing next to you and doesn't have bread and you're eating bread, you should give them bread, because food can be regrown, people can't, right? And so, I mean, that concept of charity is something that carries through over a very long period of time. We can look at, there's an Igbo proverb that I specifically put down, which talks about the idea that people, when they are holding each other down, right, have to get in the mud to do so, right? So if I'm going to oppress someone, right, there it is. He who will hold another down in the mud must stay in the mud to keep him down, right? In other words, I'm debasing myself at the same time I'm debasing you, right? And these ideas are constant. If you look at something that Lull said with regards to charity, right? He said charity was compatible with knighthood, right? Because a knight without charity will be someone who acts with ill will, right? And will engage in behavior that is wrong, and therefore is not compatible with the ideas of chivalry, right? And this is the same sort of it's the same sort of concept, right? If I'm going to be engaging in wrong behavior, right, then and taking action against people, right, I'm not only hurting them, I'm hurting myself, right? And those are things that we see across cultures, right? That aren't. I think we very much recognize them now, right? Not to be, I hope that I'm not going too far afield, but when I think about recent events in the United States and the horrifying incident in Minneapolis, right? That man, as he was doing the things that he did, right, demeaned himself and demeaned the concept of what it was to be a human being while engaging in the violence that he engaged in upon another human being, right? And so we find that those moral ideas are true across time, right, and across cultures. And then we can also talk about warrior codes, like Bushido and various other philosophies that provide similar guidelines to how a person should act, right?
Yeah, and I love your series. If you can't tell by the fact that I'm like, every time one comes up, I'm like, yeah, this is great. I would love you to speak. Well, I know we have a few pulled out, and I didn't want to jump around without checking in with you first. But I would love you to speak more to the ones we have, because I just love it. I love your commentary on it, and I love seeing all of the different perspectives that you were able to tease out, because I like that we're looking at these concepts of the virtues and of chivalry as a larger entity from so many different perspectives. Not just because, like, DEI, it's kind of like inclusivity is my little jam, but it's important for us all to be able to relate to this. And a lot of people just don't relate necessarily to the most popular known sources of dialogue on chivalry. Right. It's just not immediately relatable. Like, I can't connect to this. Or if I can connect to it, I'm like, I like that. I don't like that part, right. Not about it. So yeah, I would love you to speak more to this. I will pull up whatever on the screen you want, or you can share. But
Yeah, if you want to, pull one of them up, I can talk about them. The thing is that what I hope to do by going ahead and putting up these various messages, right, was I wanted to have a discussion about how we think about it now, right? How we think about chivalry. As a member of the Order of Chivalry, I feel obligated to try to advance that idea as far as I can in the SCA, and I try to do it in my life as well. By no means am I an exemplar in all of the things that I put up. That's one of the reasons in many cases I do put them up. I go, I need to work on that. I need to do this more and practice it better, right? But this is one of the things that I wrote specifically, which was chivalry, to the extent that it is virtuous, is based around principles of obligation and service, binding its adherents to use their strength justly, prudently, courageously, and equitably for all, right? And that is basically my whole concept as to boil down on chivalry and how it should apply to the SCA, right? That all of the oaths and all of the ideas that we have regarding behavior, right, boil down to this idea, right? It's the principles we have, the obligations we have to each other as members of the society, to each other as members of the larger societies that we belong to, right? And the idea that we should engage in just, prudent, courageous, and equitable behavior, right? One of the things, and one of the reasons I put in courage is actually due to a quote. I was minded of it. That is, let me pull it up. It was by the author C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia books. And he said, courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point, right? And it's the idea that when we examine, the virtues, it's not just about this abstract idea, right? It must necessarily be something that is practiced as well, right? That we need to engage in these behaviors, right? And the inability to engage in these behaviors is frequently a matter of courage. Am I willing to be strong and prudent and courageous in the face of something that's very difficult? For example, if another member of the Order of Chivalry does something that I find objectionable, or any person does something I find objectionable, what if they're a friend? Am I willing to confront them, right? Am I willing to have that very difficult conversation, right? Am I willing to take action, right? And so I think it's something important to emphasize, is the extent to which courage plays a role in all of it.
all right, I'm gonna jump. I know we talked about the Igbo one. Unless you want to go over anything else with that. That that's here. I like that we're seeing that, because this is so, again, not something that people normally think of when you think of where the SCA is and where we're drawing our kind of mission from. That's not where you go.
Right. I've got some quotes from the Yoruba as well. Yoruba proverbs that I've put up, as well as obviously there's significant commentary from Lao Tzu and Confucius, and across multiple cultures. Now she is actually writing in the period, and I'm trying to remember. My brain is blanking. I'm just a little nervous. Mid 13th or mid 14th century, and I one century or the other, and I'm just not remembering which. The man or the woman in whom resides greater virtue is the higher. Neither the loftiness nor the lowliness of a person lies in the body according to the sex, but in the perfection of conduct and virtues, right? And I think that's something that modern people can relate to very easily, right? The idea that the concepts of chivalry, that human conduct, that their value is not related to their gender. And now we can add, in addition to their sex, right, we can add the concepts of gender expression and gender identity, right? And how those things likewise, do not determine the value or worth of a human being, right? They are factors that lie outside that. How we should be judging people is, as Martin Luther King would say, the content of their character, not the color of their skin or their expression of identity.
And before we move on from that one, she's actually one of my favorite writers.
Oh yeah.
Italian connection. But I love the fact that she writes in defense of the idea that women were not, that virtue could not reside in women, because they weren't able to really be virtuous because of original sin. And so a lot of her poems, a lot of her writing is actually exemplifying prudence, because she's reasoning with men who honestly believe her not to be as human as they are, on her humanness and on her virtuousness and on her intellect. I really appreciate that she kind of exemplified chivalry while she was doing this.
Mm-hmm. So this I wrote. A friend asked me to, as I was putting up quotes, asked me to talk about how chivalry should present itself in the modern era, I guess. Is the best way of phrasing it. And so I just wrote down my thoughts on it, which was: a reimagining of the code of chivalry and the revitalization of its virtues necessitates that concepts such as strength and weakness, courage and kindness are no longer bound to characteristics of identity, but are recognized as common to every human being. And that, feeds into what Christine de Pizan was saying, right? It feeds into, a number of other ideas. But the reason I specifically stated reimagining and revitalization is because, deservedly, chivalry has been attacked by feminists and by a number of people who criticize the fact that it does tend to engage in not just patriarchal but paternalistic behavior, as well as benevolent sexism, right? The idea that as we were just discussing, that somehow women are inherently weaker, that somehow we should defend women but not men, because women need to be defended, right? And those things are simply not true. The strength and weakness, the courage and kindness in an individual are individual characteristics that the individual expresses in their action, not by virtue of how they were born, right? Or the manner in which they live their lives, outside of concept.
Yeah. And we are going to talk more about that, because I have stuff to say. I always have stuff to say. But we will circle back to that concept, because I think it's a big one, and I do want to talk more on it. One more, and then
okay. Yes. So this one I put down, pretty early on, and one of the reasons was it was something I thought was very important in the SCA, especially, and you'll see it obviously everywhere. But someone is given a title, right? And we begin to honor that person simply because of the fact that they're given a name, right? And the reality is that the title should only has value if the person with it brings honor to that title. And honor in this case is not referring to the idea of being honest or forthright. The concept of public approbation, The benefit of the title, the saying someone is a good person and talking about them publicly, right? And so, in fact, speaking of Yoruba, I'll pull something up that's actually a quote that applies directly to this from the Yoruba. If you'll give me half a second, I didn't have it ready, but I know right where it is. And what it talks about is the idea of not taking a particular title unless you are well suited to it. And it puts it in very interesting language. The Yoruba frequently relate things to natural things in their environment. And this particular proverb is, one cannot be given the title eagle and yet be incapable of snatching chickens, right? And it sounds funny, but the idea is very solid. It's that if you're not going to be, if you're not going to engage in peer-like behavior, as an example, right? You shouldn't be given the title of peer, right? You shouldn't be a person, should be capable of the things that they are given titles for, and they should bring honor to those titles through their actions, not because they have it, right? In other words, to use the Yoruba concept, just because I named something an eagle, it doesn't mean it can fly down and snatch a chicken out of the yard, right? It may be very incapable of that.
I think that's also important to remember when we talk about behavior in our code of conduct, what we expect of our participants, no matter what their titles are in the game. If there is an issue with your behavior, it quickly becomes an out-of-game management situation. So titles then don't matter. When an officer is instructing you on code of conduct, when maybe discipline is being applied, and in my opinion, when we're evaluating someone's behavior, if you do have a title, it's almost as if we hold you to a higher standard because we know that you know better. I mean, if you are a royal peer, I know that you've read Corpora, I know that you've read Kingdom Law. So ignorance can't be claimed when it comes to not knowing what was expected of you as far as like kindness and courtesy, chivalry. So part of this panel that we're having right now is about out-of-game management in a way. So I just wanted to slip that in while we're talking about chivalry. If you are being instructed on maybe your behavior at an event, at that point, your title doesn't matter. We're all just participants in the SCA.
I think you're coming to a really interesting point, which is kind of the idea that is there a higher expectation to live by what we have designated as kind of the SCA code of chivalry, right? For people who have achieved more game side, because many of the the titles are all linked to things that we do within the framework of the game itself, the SCA itself. But there is, in my opinion, I mean, I don't turn into a different person. I might be embodying a persona, but I am me, and I am treating my friends with the respect that I give my friends as a person, right? As a human. So when we look at kind of the differences in like, are some people held to higher standards? And I think arguably, yes. You mentioned in Corpora how it's written out that we have these expectations of peers, that you have a job and your job is to fulfill these expectations. But the idea is for everyone, right? Everyone in the SCA. If you come to the SCA, the expectation is that you are going to abide by our code of conduct, which is so heavily based, again, on these concepts of chivalry and what we bring, what we take from them, what our study and our representation of them encompasses. I think it's interesting. I think it's very interesting. And when you get that step removed, right? We are talking about this from a slightly out of game perspective. It's very meta. But that doesn't mean that we are different people talking about this. Like Zahra does not have a different opinion than Jessica on this. It is very consistent. So I think that's interesting. I think it's interesting the different standards that are held. I think the expectation to educate yourself and be more aware of what this encompasses and how it reflects on the SCA is higher for peers of all types. But we literally, I mean, we have an order of chivalry, right? So you expect people's behavior to be informed by this. I don't know. I think it's very interesting. And then you bring up the idea of officers, right? So your title doesn't matter if you are engaging in problematic behavior by our policy. Certainly, I am not myself a peer, but as an officer, I write these policies keeping in mind anyone. I don't expect to allow certain people to behave outside of our code of conduct just because they have a certain title or don't have a certain title. The expectation is that you know our core values and you know what we're here to do, and you've agreed to do it just by coming to an event. So I think that interacts in a very interesting way, the within the game, with out of the game, how we conceptualize it modernly versus historically. Very complicated.
Can we say that louder for the folks in the back though? Like, just in case you didn't know, it is in corpora that if you are at SCA events, if you're participating in SCA spaces, even online, you are agreeing to abide by the tenets of our core values. That's our code of conduct. And it's on our SCA.org webpage. And it kind of just outlines a lot of the concepts we're talking about now, courtesy and kindness and respect and honor. So just in case you didn't know, surprise, you've agreed to be courteous and kind when you hang out with us and in SCA spaces.
That is true. I think some people either they aren't familiar, or they think maybe it's only like for members. It is built into our events themselves. You show up, this is what you have tacitly agreed to, and these are the standards that we expect. We have an expectation that you will try to live up to these standards, no matter who you are. So yes, that is definitely something to highlight for everyone. I agree. Do we want to hop into the questions? Does anyone else want to do any kind of wrap up about where we're at right now, or do we want to hop into the questions and start talking a little bit around those?
I think the questions would be good. Is that okay with you, Gigi?
Yeah, that's good.
Cool. All right. So, our first question. So, the concept of chivalry necessarily has had to change throughout the years. Although not specific to gender, there is a tendency of chivalric acts even today crossing over into expressions of benevolent sexism. Can you speak to this and provide some examples of how to address it from a DEI perspective?
So I think the first thing I'd want to make sure is that people understand mutual exclusion. Some things are mutually exclusive and some things are not. If like I said earlier, you see me walking across a field that's uneven terrain and I'm in a houppelande, right, voluminous, and I have on patins and I'm trying to carry a basket or several boxes, and you want to help me, I would welcome the help, absolutely. And that is something I think people do look at as like a chivalric act. Carrying a lady's basket if she needs help, holding a door open. But yes, I do believe it could cross over into expressions of benevolent sexism, which would be the idea that that I need help because I'm a woman, and that if a man was in the same situation, he wouldn't need help. And I don't agree with that. If I saw anyone of any gender walking across the field with boxes and it was muddy and they had a houppelande on, I would want to help them because that situation screams assist them.
Right. Yeah, the thing that I try to look at when I'm trying to solve questions like this, right? Because there's a lot of ways to answer them, right? We could just say, well, just educate people that men and women are functionally equal in a lot of ways, and we should just treat them the same, right? Which is the really simple and easy answer, but culturally, it's harder to accomplish that all at once, right? The thing, however, though, is I like to apply the virtues themselves when considering it, right? So what I immediately look at is I look at it and go, okay, from a DEI perspective, right, what we're looking at is a situation where you have a woman, a man, someone crossing a field, right? Consider the issue prudently. Think about it. Does that person look like they need help? If they need help, then the reality is that you should feel obligated to do so, right? Not simply because of their gender or because of any other characteristic, right? But because they appear to be in need of assistance, right? And you know, there's also one of the damaging aspects of benevolent sexism is the what it does. I think I talked to you guys about this earlier before we started talking, but the idea that somehow I am necessarily stronger, right, in some way, in some measurable manner than women are, right? Yeah, I'm 6'3", I'm 225, I'm physically probably stronger than the vast majority of women, right? But in that moment, when I'm carrying 7 pole arms across the field, simultaneously balancing my helmet and 3 pieces of armor, trust me, anyone who comes up and offers me help, I'm not in a better situation than anybody else is in that. I've only still got 2 arms, right? I've only still got the ability to navigate, through whatever spaces I'm moving through that I have, right? And that's the thing. But what we teach men, right, and what we teach probably too many people is the idea that strength necessarily means you should not need help, right? And to an extent, that's something that should not be considered part of chivalry, right? That's not what strength really means in that case, right?
Agreed. And I don't know if Jessica, you're going to touch on this, but when we talk about people addressing their own biases, so this would be an opportunity for a person to think about the situation and evaluate how they would react if it was a non-binary person, a male, a female, if it was, raining, or think about what you would do and think about your first, what were your first thoughts? What is your reaction? And if it's not, what is the good and right thing to do? Help the person. If it's something else, then that's something you should work on yourself. Mm-hmm. But I'll let Jessica answer. Do you have any words for this question?
I do.
Or do we cover
I very much agree with the aspects of it that you're highlighting, and I'm glad that you brought up the idea that gender is much more complex, right? And historically it has been complex, but we have not been speaking about it kind of in the public sphere as openly until fairly recently in this culture. So when we talk about benevolent sexism, we are tapping into and we talked about this too, the unhealthy construction of masculinity. We are tapping into this kind of paternalism that we don't want to bring into the SCA. There are assumptions that go with benevolent sexism, and that assumption is usually, I know what's better for you. And not just that, but I know what's better for you than even you do. So here's this thing, and this is the way that I will show you courtesy. It won't be by honoring and respecting your ideas. It will be by, I'll carry your stuff across this field. As you stated, I am sure that there are many times where if you are struggling under 7 pole arms and a helmet, anyone who is offering to help you there is providing the service that you need, right? A particularly proactive Saint Bernard would be helpful at that point in your life. So when we limit ourselves to these kind of unhealthy constructions of this, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice collectively for everyone. We are not allowing those who are dealing with receiving the kind of benevolent sexism to have the agency to determine things. We are hurting people who may very well need the help and just are never thought to be offered it. It's just generally problematic, and much like sexism in general, it's bad for everyone. It's not just bad for the minority group. There are negative impacts to the dominant group in this case as well. When we talk about examples, we've talked about kind of carrying things across a field. I think another example of how this can manifest is the kind of savior complex, right? You've got a member of a dominant group who comes in and they go, oh my God, like I know how to fix this. I will fix this for you. And you go, well, I mean, I could really use, and they're like, oh, I've got it. Don't worry your pretty head. And you're like, dude, it's not helpful if you don't listen to what I need from you. It's frustrating. So when examples of how to address it. So when I see that, I generally try to remind people from the outset, you need to listen to what people need. You don't know them better than they know themselves. So sometimes people cannot articulate what they need at that moment, and it's okay to float the, should I do this? Can I help you with this? But if people are like, dude, I need this, like I need you to do this thing for me, and you're like, nah, then you're not really being helpful. You're not really engaging in any kind of chivalrous behavior. You're just doing whatever makes you happy. And that's not valuable to other people.
That actually, just reminded me of a virtue that I completely skipped humorously. In that humility, right, is something that, really should be central to an understanding of chivalry, especially in the modern age, right? And especially with I think in dealing with DEI issues, one thing, that sometimes people have to shut up and listen. They have to be quiet and learn, and they have to consider carefully how their actions will be, perceived, or how their actions affect populations of people, and accept that, a humble position in that, right? That there's not necessarily that just because I am who I am doesn't mean I know better, right? Like you were saying.
I could talk about humility for the next like 4 hours. It's such a layered thing, but okay. I'm gonna jump to the next question. If we have time and we want to circle back, I will have my patience and my suffering, and I will not jump on that because okay. Let's do the next question. How does the phrase "shield of the weak" tie in with concepts of DEI? Now I know "shield of the weak" is part of the Shiv oath in my kingdom. I don't know if that phrase is as prevalent everywhere else because I just don't have the anthropology knowledge to know. But shield of the weak is something that I have heard. It can be very good and it can be very bad. But I would, that's going to be a hard one, I think, to talk about. But yeah, how does it tie in with concepts of DEI?
So the phrase shield of the weak, I assume when we're talking about it, we're referring to kind of the romantic Arthurian concept of chivalry and knighthood and those virtues associated with those individuals. Out west, generally the oath that's varies either more individually or is related to the original oath that we swear, that knights swore all the way back to the beginning of the society, which is directly related to the oath that Pippin swears to Denethor in in the Lord of the Rings. Fact, right? Is what it is. Shield, but going back to the actual topic, the shield of the. I'm not a big fan of using the term weak, right? The reason being, am I still connected? Can you hear me? Okay. It's telling me my internet connection's unstable, so just making sure. I'm not a big fan of using the term weak. There's not a good word to replace it, so it's it is what it is. But I think it's actually an important concept when you consider it in the wholeness of in the whole ideal of chivalry, not just the order of chivalry itself. We all should be standing between people who are in a situation where they're being harmed by someone, by an oppressor, or by you're a bystander in a situation where something is going wrong, right? We should take action, whether that action is to physically interpose ourselves or not, right? The shield does not necessarily have to be your body, right? It can be using the law, it can be using the organizational structure as it exists. It's about taking action in a situation that promotes ideas of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Someone is subject to biased behavior of any sort, right? Action should be taken. And that's really, I think, the best way of thinking, for me, the best way of thinking about it in terms of the shield of the weak with regards to DEI.
So shield of the weak is one of those phrases where the first time I heard the mid-realm knight's oath, which is very, I think, very moving. I was just like, yeah, this is real. Like, this is deep. I love it. Like, it was a big thing for me. And then I kind of thought more about it, and I was like, oh, well, I mean, I guess weak isn't a great, like, maybe we shouldn't lean in on that phrasing. But I think as we modernize our understanding and we recontextualize the concept, we are all weak at different points in our existences. We are none of us strong all of the time, and so rather than weak being an indication of person as an entity, I take it as an indication of current status and current being, and the idea that there is always a point in time where you can use help facing the rest of the world, right? And so that kind of idea of like someone putting themselves between you and the rest of the world, mentally I recontextualize it to be when I need the help, when I am feeling weak, when I need that, someone will be there, and someone will stand in between whatever I am afraid of, and afraid, worried, whatever, and myself. And yes, like you said, it doesn't have to be a physical like it can be very much someone using our policies. It can be very much someone doing their best to protect you from from a distance. It doesn't have to be the very physical shield between a physical enemy, because so much of what we deal with within the SCA is not someone aggressively coming towards us. And that's actually a very modern concept of when we talk about unhealthy masculinity. We talk about people being ready for this kind of physical, like I'm the protector, I'm here to do this. Okay, but what I really need protecting from is not this big scary bad that might break into my house. It is far more likely that what I need protection from is emotional abuse, or being overwhelmed by having to do all of the emotional labor, or carry, we talk about the mental load. Like, there's so many different ways in which you can support someone and be a shield for them against the world. I think you take the phrase and you deconstruct it and you unpack it, and then you recontextualize it within what we face in a modern world, and not what was maybe faced then, or even what we see faced in like movies and games. It's just not that. Sometimes it's a lot less zesty, right? It's not as zesty to be like, shield of the weak, I'm gonna do these dishes, you're not gonna have to worry about them, got you. But sometimes that's what people need. Yeah, I think we recontextualize it and it looks a little different.
One thing that I can, an example that comes to mind is microaggressions. You know, we face them, all of us, in our own ways every day, depending on what groups we belong to, right? What communities we belong to. But when you witness something like that going on, do you say something? When you see something, do you say something? And sometimes that might be a way to be a shield of the weak, is to speak up and say, hey, that wasn't okay. We don't say things like that in the SCA. And I think that also takes not only, I don't know, I think it takes courage. I think Van brought that up, that courage is something, a virtue that kind of embodies all the others. And I think speaking up, being a shield of the weak takes courage, and the way that we're talking about it in a modern SCA way.
No, I very much agree. Like I said, sometimes it's not that kind of immediate, there's a very clear path to being someone's shield. Sometimes it means putting yourself in a situation where you're like, I don't want to deal with this. Like, I don't want to jump in front of this. I don't want to get involved. Yeah, I can definitely see, I can think of a ton of things where, yeah, it's about being courageous enough to do what you need to do. Potentially at, a lack of care, not care, but a lack of prioritization of the self and your comfort. So I'm going to jump to the next question. I'm just going to go down the list. So Van and Gigi, just so you know. So how does a knight use their strength equitably? I understand the word, but not the exact way the quote intends its meaning. So that sounds like maybe a Van quote, one of your quotes.
So equity is not equality, first off, right? And we can get into that whole set of definitions, but but basically the idea, when I say using strength equitably, is to try to create a situation where people can achieve the same level of success inside the organization, regardless of where they're coming from, right? So it was a bit performative, but I'll give you an example of something that I did take part in. And the reason I say it's performative is that it didn't necessarily promise action afterwards. We have taken action since then in the kingdom, but I very much wanted to be involved after the after things occurred in Caid a couple of years ago with regards to the presence of certain symbols at that caused a lot of problems for the organization. And in Antir, a large number of peers decided to get together and put together a letter that basically spoke to the fact that we wanted to identify some of us that we wanted to say, hey, we are here for you. We do not, support hatred. We want a more diverse, equitable, inclusive organization, and we will work towards these things. And not only did I, sign the letter, but I advocated for it. And when it was initially introduced in court, I was the person who asked someone to come forward and read the letter, right? And so I spoke very publicly about it, right? And I've advocated very actively, for issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when I say strength, I'm not necessarily meaning my physical body, right? Again, it's very much the fact that I have a platform to an extent by virtue of the fact that I have a belt and chain, right? And a long period of time in the SCA. And so I can take action that promotes a more equitable society. And by society, I mean society of creative anachronism, not, obviously all of the above, but yeah. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Okay. I think so. Really quick, I will do the zoom through spiel. So like equality being kind of the idea that everyone gets the same thing, right? And that's cool. Thanks for coming to the show tonight. I will be sending you all a medium t-shirt. Now for some of you, you're gonna be like, sweet, a medium, it's gonna work for me. For some of you, you're gonna be like, yeah, okay. Because you'll either be swimming in it or you won't be able to get into it at all. So equity would be me giving you what you need to potentially succeed. That would be me saying, hey, thanks for coming to the show. What size shirt do you wear? That's what size you'll be getting. So you'll get your extra small or your 2XL, whatever you want will be the thing that you get. And that way everyone has that available to them. Now you can choose, you can be like, I don't want a shirt at all. I'm not going to do this. But that's your choice. The option is there. And so that's kind of what we mean when we talk about the idea of equality versus equity. Just on a really quick kind of go through, we talk about it to a much greater degree in the definitions and concepts course, and different people teach a lot about it in different ways. But giving people the same thing isn't always fair because people need different things to succeed. It's only ever fair if people are coming from the same place, they want the same thing, and they need the same thing to succeed. That's my Reader's Digest version of equality versus equity. There's two questions next that I want to kind of bring together because I think that they're speaking to the same idea. So one piece of dissonance lies in that there are two levels of chivalry: a practice of certain behaviors, but also an exclusive group made up of mostly white men. That group makes it easy to question the term chivalry in addition to its historical meanings as it applies to everyone. Can the SCA let go of the term chivalry and all its baggage? And then the question that I thought was kind of related, close enough that I want to pull it into the same discussion, is perhaps the virtues of nobility and courtesy are better suited than chivalry, less patriarch laden words. So that's big.
It is big. I think I like the comment that nobility and courtesy, or honor and courtesy, respect and courtesy, using other more specific concept words that we have a better definition for instead of just chivalry, may be something that needs to happen just so that we're explaining what we mean. Whether they're better suited than using chivalry at all, I can't answer that for everyone in the society. For me, I think I love words. I like having lots of different words to use in different situations. I like explaining what they mean. I like debating what they mean. I like philosophizing on the origins and etymology. So I think this is just another opportunity for us to do that. We are, after all, a historical education society, right? So these kind of conversations, I think, are good for us to have, even at events, talking about them. In fact, in the past, there were many, especially 15th, 16th century Italy, which is my area of study, many books were written on manners and comportment and debating, what is the right way to behave as a noble. So I think us talking about and debating about and questioning what is the right way to behave chivalrously in the SCA, and even is that word okay to use, is something that we should be talking about in all of our circles.
Yeah, so there are words and symbols that they're gone, right? They have been taken and twisted and they're gone, and there is no way to retrieve them, and there's no way for us to recontextualize them at this current moment in time. And we should use them only thoughtfully and only carefully, and never just with the kind of lackadaisical, whatever works. I don't think chivalry is irretrievable. I think that if we're looking at potentially problematic behavior, it will exist regardless. I don't know that using a different word in that case is going to be the thing that saves it. I definitely see kind of the Victorian chivalry it is problematic. It is. It can be. But we're having conversations like this about the word because I think we do need to take it and drag it into what we mean in the SCA and into a modern age. I think that it is very much a touchstone for people. And I think it would be hard to let go of as a term. Now, nobility, courtesy, honor, these are all much more specific and useful to a point. But we are still hitting that wall of like, well, what does this mean to you? How does this look for you? We talk about even something like, our armored system is honor-based as far as blows. And I have heard people talk about courtesy both in the I will do you the courtesy of not taking shots that I feel did not land with enough force. And I will do you the courtesy of taking any shot that is well struck, even if not to the force that I expect. And I've heard those discussions, and I've heard it used to justify literally the polar opposite behavior. And I'm not offering an opinion on that. What I am saying is that when we talk about language differentials like this, we have to expect that there's going to be confusion no matter what word we're using. And so it's better to have the robust conversation, do whatever kind of bright lining of definitions that we need to do to make things clear, than it is to say like, well, I guess we'll just switch to a different word. Also because people won't do it, right? If this is something that they hold close to their heart, we can change the language all we want. I live in Chicago. We have the Sears Tower. It got changed to a different name like years ago, like 10 or 15 years ago. No one calls it that. I think it's like the Willis. No one calls it that. It doesn't matter what it is because it's the Sears Tower. That's the touchstone. That's the cultural heart of it. And no one has changed their language around it. And so I think it's going to be hard to let go of it. But we do need to acknowledge the baggage, what's problematic about it. Let's talk about that. Let's make sure that we are embodying the positive parts of this and not bringing in the negative parts with that historical justification. So that's my stance on it.
So I tend to think about chivalry in terms of virtue, right? The reason being, if I spend an awful lot of time thinking about it, I've read a lot of material on chivalry over the years, right? I'm pretty conversant with its origins. I'm pretty conversant with its antecedents in both Germanic and Roman societies, the extent to which it borrowed from certain Muslim or Southwest Asian ideas, the extent to which it was a literary construct, all of these things, right? But the core of it, as we understand it, because words have power, but they don't have a fixed meaning, right, means that we can reimagine words. There are words that are reclaimed by groups all the time, right? There are words that have changed definitions dramatically historically. One of my favorite examples is the word paradigm, right? Which has a completely different meaning than it originally had now, right? And the thing is that when we talk about words, right, when we talk about the concept of chivalry, it's an ideogram, right? It doesn't mean a discrete single thing. It means a set of ideas, and the set of ideas that we hold chivalry to mean is virtuous behavior, right? And when we talk about virtuous behavior, the step that we need to take is telling people what we mean when we say virtuous behavior, right? It's just like the idea of a knight, right? When we say to people who grew up in America or significant parts of Western Europe that a particular person is a knight, they have an idea, right? They may draw on the medieval concept, they may draw on the modern honorary concept, but they're thinking of someone who has been lauded for conduct or a thing, right? And there are all sorts of cultural trappings associated with that word, right? But we understand generally what that thing means. And we need to re-emphasize what it means to be chivalrous, right? And by that, we mean functionally be good, right? Be a good human being who does good things, is generous and serves other people appropriately, and is thoughtful and humble and kind and loves other people and engages in justice and is equitable in their behavior and encourages diversity, encourages inclusion, all of these things, which are fundamental concepts of virtue, right? If we want to get rid of the word chivalry, I'm fine with that. You know, I'm a member of the Order of Chivalry. I can be the Order of the Belt or the Order of the Chain. It doesn't matter to me, right? Because the thing to me is not that word, right? The thing to me is the virtuous behavior. The term chivalry includes this really beautiful encapsulation of certain ideas of virtuous behavior. And while many of them are deeply, you know, attached to ideas that we, as the questioner asked, you know, pointed out, are attached to the patriarchy, attached to religious concepts, attached to, frankly, the behavior of colonialists in the New World, right, and in Africa. You know, I mean, I could attach it to a number of very negative characteristics, right? But we can also take that thing and set it aside. It is not necessarily in the category, as you were pointing out, something like the swastika or you know, various symbolism on that order. I think there is an opportunity, as I said, to reimagine and revitalize the word and revitalize the virtues attached to it.
Yeah, and I do want to further kind of dig into one idea of it, which is that, so it's the exclusive group that's named for it, right? So how do we square the behavior and the exclusivity? And I think you did start to touch on it a bit, with the idea that, like, hey, we could call it something else and it would still not be significantly different. But is that a perspective that the rest of the SCA shares, right?
So that's a difficult question. There are people who would probably say that they're attached to the virtuous ideas of chivalry. They're the same people, in my opinion, who would say, if you took away the opportunity to fight for crown from heavy fighters, many of us would still fight with rattan and armor, right? Because it's the doing of the thing that is where the joy is to be found. For me, the concept of thinking about the virtues, the concept of attempting to practice them, the concept of refining them in myself and encouraging others to find joy in that pursuit as well, is what I personally see as the value of what we do, right? When we're engaging in chivalrous behavior and in the emphasis of it, in virtuous behavior. Is it an opinion that's broadly held by everyone? Probably not. You know, it's an opinion held by a significant number of people, I would say. I will say that humans tend to hold on to things probably far longer than they need to. How's that? We tend to grip onto ideas and concepts, you know, without a really good reason to do so, when we could surrender them and maybe the world would be a heck of a lot easier.
I'm not going to argue with that. I live that sometimes. I'm not going to argue with it because occasionally I embody it. All right. Next question. And if anyone else has any questions, please do send them in. We're getting close to wrapping up, and I want to make sure that if folks want to chat about anything, that we can do it. So the next question: how do you handle claims that making complaints is unchivalrous or discourteous? Because in game we are supposed to be courteous, and ruffling feathers is thought to be, quote, bad form.
So I have a couple of thoughts on that question. I think that you can evaluate a claim and dismiss it if it does not apply. If you have witnessed behavior that is inappropriate, if you have witnessed actions that fly in the face of our policies or and go contrary to our core values, then I think making a complaint about it is what we should do. It is the good and right thing to do. It is the honorable thing to do, because if you say what you saw, it will keep perhaps someone from being hurt, someone from being disrespected, someone from being insulted, someone from being actually physically accosted. If you bring a problematic action to the attention of our officers so that they can address it. And addressing it could be going to that person and saying, hey, that wasn't okay. We don't do that in the SCA. Don't do it again. And now that person knows for sure that it's not okay and they shouldn't do it. All the way up to, it could end up with the police being called because you broke the actual physical law, criminal law, or that you get, sanctioned by your kingdom because of something. Like, there's different levels, but it always starts with, hey, let that person know what they did wasn't okay. So I think if you get a complaint that you were discourteous because you made a complaint, that you were unchivalrous, you can evaluate it and say, was I, was what I did unreasonable? Was it petty? Was it because I, wanted to get back at someone? Why did I do what I did? If it was because you wanted to uphold our policies and core values, then you can dismiss that that complaint against what you did. That's my opinion.
This is it's adjacent to a soapbox that I've hopped on very recently. So the idea of ruffling feathers is considered to be bad form, or kind of creating waves is considered to be bad form. So something we talk about a lot is how inaction is inaction, right? If you are tacit in situations of oppression, you are supporting the person doing the oppressing because they have the power, and the person who is dealing with that unchivalrous behavior or lack of courtesy is usually not in the position of power to do anything about it. So I do very much agree. It is good and right to intercede if you can use your platform to enact good. So making complaints, I think by the very phraseology, right? Complaining is kind of just not. It's a poorly connotated word. But stepping in to ensure that our core values are being followed, that people are being treated equitably and with courtesy, it's not tied to that negative connotation of complaining. We should be doing what is within our power to keep this shared community healthy. And that's what you do. I know there are places where the culture is very much about keeping the peace. But like I mentioned, that reinforces the status quo, and it doesn't actually help things, because sooner or later things do reach a boiling point or a breaking point for people, and either things explode or we lose people. That just is what it is. Like, people will not deal with unchivalrous behavior over and over and over again without going somewhere where they don't have to experience it. I don't personally see a lot of that talked about. I know it happens. I know it does. I've seen it happen, but I don't see it talked about a lot. I think even talking about it in the areas where it happens is kind of the bad form, right? So even calling it out in some areas is this very kind of meta, like, oh, don't say that. But I'm big on communication, and I'm big on being clear about what problems are so that we can find a way to address them, or talk about what different perspectives on them look like. Things are rarely as cut and dry as they may seem with only one perspective in the mix. And sometimes people are acting out of ignorance rather than malice. So I think it's important that we we don't shy away from making waves or ruffling feathers, and that we engage when we need to and where we can. Do you guys have anything else on that one? Okay.
I think you both touched on everything I really could think to say, except I just think that, just to reemphasize, I actually disagree fundamentally with the idea that making a complaint is either unchivalrous or discourteous, and would say that it is the essence of chivalry to be courageous and to take action when you see something is done that is wrong, and courtesy is a word that is frequently misused by people to control the content of their speech and actions. And while courtesy is obviously incredibly valuable, a complaint does not need to be discourteous. It can be a complaint where you very specifically just deal with that person or that event in courteous terms, right? You don't need to insult someone if you're going to file a complaint against them. I mean, you don't need to be rude about it. It can just be an expression of the events that occurred. But no, I think it's very chivalrous to engage in filing a complaint if it's a necessary complaint.
All right, so I do have a question that I feel is a little bit outside of the scope of the panel. I want to read it, and then I want to talk a little bit about where the answer to this can lie. So there is no power to hold accountable a bad crown for the average Scadian. In order to seek justice from someone of rank and privilege, the average Scadian has to either seek the support of people of rank or endure a process that can often lead to greater pain and injustice, as seen in the lived experiences of many people. What is the society doing as an entity to bring equity to conflict resolution? So we are here discussing kind of the idea of chivalry as a word and how it applies as we see it. We are not necessarily speaking on behalf of the society, TM. And so I don't think this is within the scope of the panel, but we do have the topical town halls. We had our first one. This is something that different members of the corporate office will be getting together and speaking on issues more related to policy, answering questions that people have about just basically anything, right? Our governing docs, corpora, the direction we're headed in, et cetera, et cetera. We did talk a little bit about this because our last town hall was the investigations and sanctions group of people, right? So we had Liz, who is the Society Seneschal, we had John Bearkiller, who is the president, and then we had Dan Watson, who is a member of the BOD. So we did speak to some degree about holding bad crowns accountable. We had a specific question on that, and I do want to refer you back to that panel. It is archived currently on the main SCA Facebook page and will be up on the SCA YouTube. That is a place where you can get a definitive answer from people who are speaking about how they process these kinds of complaints. Now, we will be getting more town halls in. So another option is, if you watch that and you feel like your question was not sufficiently answered there, submit a question to the town halls and it'll be incorporated in. You can also email president@sca.org, or I believe is it seneschal@sca.org for Liz? So you can email John or Liz and they can give you a direct answer and you can kind of engage in more of a dialogue with them. I can tell you that from the standpoint of someone working in the corporate office, more training is being developed both through my office and through Liz, the Society Seneschal's office, where we are looking at bringing equity to conflict resolution. We are looking at different strategies for making these conversations less problematic. where we're not having to have people go through that kind of pain of having to either give potentially personally difficult experiences multiple times, where we're not looking at someone of rank and privilege and saying like, oh well, it's just not a thing that we do. You can check out also the BOD meetings. So the minutes are available. We're also going to be streaming the BOD meeting. So while you can always kind of attend if you're near Milpitas and there's not a plague, we will actually be streaming this upcoming one this weekend. This weekend. So you can definitely check that out. There will be likely not this exact conversation, but more information about what to expect and how the process works, and just kind of generally more transparency from people who can actually answer this much better than we are able to do on this specific panel. I hope that helps. Gigi, do you want to add anything on that?
A feature of the board meetings that will be streamed is a question and answer session. So if you wanted to attend one of the meetings and ask the question to the board and the society officers present at that meeting, you could also do that. So you have a couple different avenues to get input on this question that you have. I think it's a good question.
All right, I am sorry that we weren't able to directly address it. It's beyond the current scope of the panel, and honestly, it's beyond the current ability of us as participants to give you the kind of answer that deserves. But hopefully that helps. I really do recommend start with the topical town hall, because this was addressed a very similar question, if not almost the exact same. So check that out. So I have one last question, which is more of a Van and Gigi thing, because I totally don't have anything exciting. Is it possible to have a reference list of period sources? What y'all got?
Yeah, there's the Chanson de Roland, the Chanson de Guest, the Ordine de Chivalry. There is, in the early 13th century, you've got the Book of the Order of Chivalry by Ramon Lull. I recommend the Fallows translation. There is A Knight's Own Book of Chivalry, which is a 14th century text by Geoffrey de Charny. And then I strongly recommend the Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, who is writing about proper Italian 15th century, Giada. 16th?
16th century, yes.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah. And those are the ones that immediately leap to mind. There are more, but those are probably the most prominent ones I can think of.
And the one by Lull probably has a list of references in the back of it. So it'll be like a snowball effect. Look at these references, Google them, and then there'll be more references attached to those papers that are done by people who cite those works and cite other works that are similar. It's a nice rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, it's also a really neat rabbit hole for all sorts of things. So reading Lull, if you're ever reading a period book and you're reading a good translation, make sure to read the foreword, because those actually include some amazing amounts of information in them. The foreword that Fallows wrote to Lull includes the manner in which it is similar to the structure of the law codes of Aragon at the time. And so that sent me down a really interesting rabbit hole, reading about how laws were written and the structure of law at the time, and why he may have written the verses the way he did. And it's just, it's really interesting if you're into, history and culture. So.
Can I ask you guys if you'd be willing to, after this is done, just drop the list into the discussion in the event, so that people can kind of go back through and just grab there was a lot of French.
I'll let Van do it because my reference was the Chanson de Roland. So you have that on your list. If you could write that, that would be great because I can't write the French ones that you named either.
So yeah, if you guys could just, and it doesn't have to be immediately, right? But if you can drop it in the discussion for the event, then people will at least have kind of a central place to just copy paste as they.
Yeah, one thing to consider is take a long look at the body of troubadour chansons, because a lot of them are deeply connected to, expressions of chivalry in the period. I don't know that necessarily they're super applicable anymore because so many of them are tied up with ideas of romance and courtly love, but certainly elements of them are. And some of them are also just really neat stories. So.
And before we wrap up, I just wanted to make sure I touched on this. We talked a lot today about modern SCA use. We use the word modern, and I want to make sure people understand that we're not talking about eschewing historical meaning. We're saying we are modern people, yes. And we are participating in the current SCA, not the SCA of 1970. So as modern people in the current SCA, we're talking about this term and how it can be applied to our play in this educational historical nonprofit. Everyone on this panel respects history and loves history, so we're not trying to eschew that at all. Just wanted to give that clarifying point.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for doing that. Because if that is not clear, I do want that to be very clear for everyone.
Okay.
All right, well, this puts us at about time. Thank you guys so much. It was such a good discussion. I really appreciate both of you being here and talking about this. And I hope that this was really valuable for everyone listening. I'm glad that we got to get through all the questions. Just a really good discussion. And I think this is important to talk about. This is a backbone of who we are. And I think it's really important. So thank you guys. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. If anyone wants to wrap up with anything, please go ahead.
Me?
Yeah.
I just would like to say that I really enjoyed the opportunity, and if anyone wants to reach out to me on social media, Facebook, or they can't find me directly, feel free to reach out to someone who might know me, for example, either Jessica or Gigi here. And I'm very willing to have conversations. I love to talk about the subject of chivalry. I like it in both the historical perspective and discussing it in terms of how I think it should be modeled in the SCA on the game side and in our modern lives. And thank you all for the opportunity and the questions. Some of them were very good. Yeah.
Same. I always learn something every time I participate in the SCA, whether it's on a panel talking about a subject or at an event or taking a class. And tonight was no exception. Thank you for allowing me to be on this panel. Thank you for asking the questions that you did, and to the other participants, Jessica and Justin, thanks for being on here with me.
It still throws me. Like, Justin, who is Justin? It's Fan. Yes, thank you so much. There will be many more things. I mean, Van, we've already got you slated for another talk, because we will be talking with members of the Order of the Chivalry with regards to DEI. So much more concrete and less general terminology, but we're literally going to be talking to a panel of knights about DEI and how they've been impacted. So look out for that. We do this every week, Wednesday evening. It's This Week in DEI. I sound like a little performer type person, but that's okay. So please look here. Next week, we will have a class about disability through the Middle Ages. So we will return to doing classes for a little bit. Very excited about that. I hope to see many of you there. Thank you for coming, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.